clashes are really not a surprise, particularly given the fact that we have had we have an unresolved border issue and we have had tensions running very strongly in the past few weeks. I guess perhaps the surprise is that the attacks came just as the president of Sudan in the north was about to visit the south.
Yes, I think the most immediate events are a bit puzzling. This week's clashes, as you also indicated, is not new and it's not the first. There has been, over the past year, there's been several incidences in some of the areas that are disputed along the border, especially around some of the oil field regions. And then I think another border issue that goes, it's not immediately on the exact border, but it's in places like southern Kordofan and the Nuba Mountains, where there are people who are still allied to the SPLM from southern Sudan, now basically living in Sudanese territory. So that has also created a very peculiar political and a security situation, which is contributing to the instability in some of those areas around the border.
Yeah, so the timing of the attack is surprising, but I suppose the bigger question is just how dangerous is this flare-up in tensions between the two countries, and what does that say about the future of South Sudan as an independent state?
Look, I think we must acknowledge the fact that the separation, any separation process like this is a massive operation of not only defining two new political entities, which is Sudan and Southern Sudan, but also to deal with questions of interests, deal with social issues of people that have to move across the borders. You know, so what we're seeing, I think, is understandable in that context, and in a way, so far, you know, we haven't seen a major escalation of conflict, although this situation has to be dealt with very quickly. You know, my question is, for example, the United Nations deployed last year a new contingent of peacekeepers specifically for the Abyei region. I think the most immediate question now for the African Union and the UN, for example, is whether there's a need for a redeployment of UN forces to other parts of the border, and if there's a need to escalate the UN intervention to get more troops to secure the border, because there has been a pact signed, a non-aggression pact between the north, between Sudan and Southern Sudan. Whether that will be respected is another question, but I think we need an international effort also to, in a sense, create a better buffer to prevent this conflict from escalating.
Yeah, so beyond the bombs and beyond, of course, this non-aggression treaty, which is now in tatters if you consider the clashes that we're talking about, what message do you think the North is sending to the South?
I think both parties have been sending each other very tough messages. Recently, President Kiir's decision in January of this year to cut off the oil exports through northern Sudan due to the dispute about payment of fees for transiting the oil through there. Southern Sudan signing an agreement with Kenya to establish a pipeline from Southern Sudan through to Lamu Island in a new export terminal. So from the southern side, there's been a very strong belligerent kind of sovereign voice saying, we will not compromise. Now the North, I think, has been answering as well, also indicating probably maybe through military means that it's also prepared to protect its interests. So we must understand that the escalation comes from both sides. And I think therefore it's incumbent on both sides, the leadership, to review the situation. And I think the realization is also there that neither, given the fact that the oil has been stopped, can actually afford a major escalation in this conflict unless they want their economies to go to complete tatters at this point in time. And I don't think we can afford that in the region.
Yeah. Now, for the fragile South Sudan, a newly independent state, very small number of people if we look at the overall population figures between the North and the South. What are its options?
Its options are fairly limited at an economic level. I think 85 to 90% of the income comes from the oil, in particular if we talk on an economic level. So if you talk of economic activity, that's the major revenue source. So they have to take care of that. There has now, as a result of the stoppage of the oil exports, there has been a move inside Southern Sudan to look into other sectors, other kinds of investments that can spark other forms of economic activity. But we must remember, Southern Sudan emerges into independence from about 40 years of war. So we are dealing with a very peculiar post-conflict phase of state-making, economic reconstruction, and the development of the society.
Yeah.
So a return to conflict will just harm the interests of Southern Sudan. So I think an option that it has is to look more towards East Africa, which I think it has been doing to its partners in Kenya and Uganda, to look at other economic incentives that can, and investments that can come into the country for at an economic level. But I think politically, in terms of its dealings with Sudan, it's been very clear that President Kiir is taking another approach now. He's becoming much more tough on his stance on very specific issues around oil, around security.
Yeah.
So I think the parties will now have to also graduate their interaction. They now have to look at each other as statesmen and not only as former allies who ran a unity government for a while, but also in a way to construct a new type of relationship.
Yeah.
And I think the question is also what role will the African Union high-level implementation panel, chaired by former President Mbeki, play in this phase of conflict?
Yeah.
And how will the AU lead a mediation effort in this circumstance?
Yeah. So who blinks first here? And what does President Kiir do now? Does he approach the north? What does he do? Does he sit still? How does he extricate himself from this mess?
I would say the way to extricate himself from that position, but also the same goes for President Bashir, is to extricate themselves from the situation. They will have to, I think, firstly work with their negotiators, the people who have been negotiating on behalf of the NCP and on behalf of the SPLM, to find a way. Maybe there's channels that they can still use to at least maintain contact with each other, and not to go for a total breakdown in communication, because the moment you have that, you create even a bigger break. And something else to note in the Sudanese context is the problem that emerged last year when we had early this year, the formation of what's called the Sudan Revolutionary Front, which is a whole new rebel movement with political objectives of fighting the Khartoum government. And this isn't related to the SPLM. So this is also putting pressure on Khartoum from another internal grouping. So Khartoum is quite beleaguered at this point in time. So President Bashir and the people who advise him will have to work very carefully with this relationship with the South, because economically it can really undermine the stability of Sudan.
Absolutely. So isn't this, though, presenting also an opportunity for the AU to raise its voice and stature here by stepping in before we see an intervention from the UN? So perhaps the AU could approach either the South or the North and arrange some kind of peace talks at least, so that these guys both at the same time are able to save face.
I fully agree that the moment is right for that now, but we must remember the African Union did, in the process of the implementation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the conduct of the referendum, and ultimately the negotiations that led to the separation of the countries, mediated by former President Mbeki, was very successful in very difficult circumstances. Before the referendum, when there were conflicts in Abyei, for example, around last year, around July, at the moment of independence in that month, there was also some serious tensions on the border. There as well, the AU managed to step in, get the parties talking. So there is a history of positive engagement and of success from the AU. But I think now it's a very peculiar moment now, because I think the AU high-level implementation panel is also coming to the end of its mandate. So there has to be a very serious discussion in the Peace and Security Council of the AU on the mandate of the AU mediation team. But then also at another level is what exact intervention will they launch now to bring the parties to some kind of agreement on the oil, but also on the security arrangements along the border.
Absolutely. History students will remember, will the real Mr. Khrushchev stand up? I guess here the question that we put out is, will the real AU stand up and be counted? Dr. Petrus de Kock, Senior Researcher, South African Institute of International Affairs.